In 1959, when Fidel Castro overthrew a corrupt and brutal government in Cuba, the initial reaction of many Americans was to welcome the bearded leader and his revolution. But it wasn't long before officials in Washington began to suspect that Castro was in fact a communist, and they began to regard his regime, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, as a dagger pointed at the United States.
In the year 1960, to contemplate a full-fledged communist state just off our shores in the Caribbean was indeed extremely shocking. Everyone's used to this now. But that was a very shocking concept.
The policy from the top was, this man has to go. And the mission to CIA was, you take him out.
In 1959, Castro came to Washington and was met by then Vice President Richard Nixon. But behind the scenes, another agenda was soon set.
If you listen to me with attention, I think that with indulgence. And then we said goodbye. Later on, I found out that immediately after our interview was over, Nixon sent a memorandum to Eisenhower telling him that I was a communist and that I had to be eliminated.
Well, were you a communist?
¿Era usted comunista?
Yo sí era comunista.
I was a communist. I personally was a communist.
This top-secret White House proposal was prepared and passed on to the CIA. The stated objective, quote, to bring about the replacement of the Castro regime.
The CIA began organizing, training, and encouraging the rebel forces during the Eisenhower administration.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear
that you will faithfully...
From the time the Kennedy administration took office, the project was sharply debated among the Kennedy advisors in the cabinet, in Congress, even within the CIA itself.
And what that debate produced was the decision to change the original strategy of infiltrating a few dozen Cuban exiles back into their homeland to link up with anti-Castro forces, to change that into a full-scale invasion.
On April 17, 1961, a U.S.-trained force of about 1,400 exiles invaded Cuba in an attempt to overthrow Castro. These CIA-sponsored soldiers were blessed aboard the invasion fleet before landing at the Bay of Pigs. The operation was a disaster. Castro, in personal command of Cuban forces, easily repelled the attack. Many of the invaders were killed. The rest were made prisoner, captured with comparative ease. Their large supply of American weapons was seized.
The CIA had, in effect, predicted that the Cuban people would be so pleased at the opportunity to overthrow Castro that they would rise up in support of the invasion force. It became very clear that was a misjudgment.
the Cuba of 1961, the advice of those who were brought in on the executive branch was also unanimous, and the advice was wrong. So that, and finally, and I was responsible, so it finally comes down that no matter how many advisors you have, frequently they are divided, and the president must finally choose.
Privately, though, Kennedy was furious with the CIA, and he promptly fired the agency's longtime director, Allen Dulles. How could I have been so stupid, he asked.
Both of the Kennedy brothers, and particularly Bobby, felt they had been booby-trapped at the Bay of Pigs, and that it became a constant preoccupation, almost an obsession, to write the record somehow. And I remember what people have said about the Kennedys in other contexts, that they learned from their father, don't get mad, get even.
And in this context, getting even meant escalating the effort to overthrow Castro, which soon led to plans for nothing less than the assassination of the Cuban leader.
The president typically says that he wants to get rid of someone. And obviously he and everybody else involved would much rather get rid of someone in a rather nice way. But if the emphasis is on getting rid of him, by whatever means have to be used, this I would have taken as an authorization.
We tried to kill Castro. I made 3 attempts to try to kill Castro, okay? Kennedy made his attempts with other people and double agents to try to kill Castro.
The CIA would even reach out to the Mafia in the person of John Rosselli.
Rosselli was fully cooperative. For 2.5 hours he told of plotting with the CIA starting in 1960 to try to kill Castro. By poison, by rifle, trying to land hit teams by powerboat. One of the boats sunk by a Cuban patrol vessel.
Fidel Castro did not take kindly to those attempts, and he had a powerful protector to turn to, the Soviet Union. In 1962, John McCone, the new CIA director, began getting reports from spies in Cuba that the Russians were setting up a dangerous military presence there.
But the most important thing to say about John McCone is that he felt, sort of in his gut, by instinct, that the Soviets probably were putting missiles into Cuba. So McCone went to the president right away and said, you know, my analysts disagree with me, but I just can't help but believe that the Soviets are doing this. And that tipped off Kennedy, President Kennedy, to start thinking about this and gathering more information about it.
A week ago this morning, the CIA took the president incomplete but strong evidence that offensive weapons were on the island. The president then ordered a full-time aerial watch of Cuba.
What the photographs showed was something on the order, as I remember, of 20 to 30 intermediate-range launchers, which could be targeted with nuclear warheads against the East Coast cities of the United States. It was an unbelievable threat to us.
The pressure on Kennedy to remove them was intense. Most of Kennedy's advisors, especially CIA boss John McCone, recommended that unless Khrushchev withdrew the missiles, U.S. forces should attack Cuba.
100,000 American troops were poised to invade Cuba. American bombers were on the alert.
The CIA said there were no nuclear warheads on the island of Cuba. The president and I thought it highly probable there were not, but we recognized the possibility the CIA was wrong. There might be warheads there.
In fact, it turned out years later that the CIA was wrong, that the Soviets did, in fact, have more than 100 tactical warheads in place on Cuban soil.
The invasion would have been in the face of nuclear attack by the Soviets without any question, and we would have had to respond with nuclear weapons. It would have been a total catastrophe.
So instead of invading Cuba, Kennedy opted for a more restrained strategy, a naval blockade. His TV address to the nation and the world put the Soviets on notice that he would not permit them to ship one more missile into Cuba.
A strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated.
Shortly after the president's speech tonight, the Defense Department said it would begin almost immediately to search and sink, if necessary, the ships of any nation carrying offensive weapons to Cuba. Soviet bloc ships are reportedly on their way there now.
Kennedy also insisted that the Soviet missiles already in Cuba had to be removed, or else.
We have said if there's rocket fire from Cuba, we will retaliate, and there goes the whole ball game.
So when the president said to me that odds were somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 that we would go to war, is probably as good an estimate as you can get.
That's kind of scary.
It's very scary.
Just one day before American military commanders were set to launch their assault on Cuba, Khrushchev sent the order in to remove the missiles.
Nikita Khrushchev today did precisely what President Kennedy has been asking him to do ever since this crisis began. He ordered the dismantling of Soviet missile bases in Cuba under United Nations supervision and the return of the rockets to the Soviet Union.
The eyeball-to-eyeball crisis had been resolved in part because the CIA's U-2 had first spotted those Soviet missiles. The U-2 would be the first in a long line of spy-in-the-sky technology perfected by the agency. What these satellites could see from space was nothing less than astonishing.
It would be as if you climbed on top of the Empire State Building and looked toward Philadelphia, and somebody in Philadelphia on top of a skyscraper was holding up a 6-inch square.
You say these satellites can photograph a 6-inch square object from 100 miles away.
And it will show up, providing the contrast and the lighting are good, yes.
I think it's really worth emphasizing that World War III
may have been averted, kept at bay, thanks to the marvelous intelligence capability that both we and, for that matter, the Soviets had during the Cold War, because those satellites and reconnaissance airplanes and spies on the ground, that allayed both sides that no first strike or surprise attack was imminent. And that allowed us to engage in diplomacy and arms control agreements, knowing full well that we were keeping an eye on them and they were keeping an eye on us. So intelligence, I think, coupled with deterrence, really helped keep the superpowers away from one another's throats.
But the Soviet Union wasn't the only enemy during those Cold War years. The United States confronted communist forces on other fronts as well, most notably in Vietnam. The CIA's role in that tragic war when the 20th century returns.